going to talk about the Dred Scott decision. All right, some of you, or maybe many of you, have actually heard about Dred Scott or the Dred Scott decision, but you don't know much about it. So I'm going to explain that to you on this video. Okay, so who was Dred Scott? Okay, Dred Scott was a slave who was originally owned by the Blow family, by Peter Blow. Now, in I think 1833, he was purchased by an army surgeon. Okay, an army surgeon basically named Dr. Emerson. Okay, now after being purchased by Dr. Emerson, Dred Scott followed Dr. Emerson on his, during his military ventures in the state or the territory of Illinois and Wisconsin. So wherever Dr. Emerson was stationed, Dred Scott followed him. And this went on for about 2 years of Dred Scott following Dr. Emerson into the Illinois territory and Wisconsin territory, which were then, at that time, free states. Okay, they had become free states due to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That made these areas free states. For 2 years, Dred Scott, who was a slave, had been living in free states. Now, eventually, Dr. Emerson was assigned to St. Louis, where Dred Scott also followed him. And then eventually, Dr. Emerson was reassigned to Louisiana. Okay, he was relocated to East Louisiana. Now, when he went to Louisiana, he left Dred Scott in St. Louis. Okay, now during this period of time, Dred Scott actually worked. Even though he was still legally a slave, he worked and earned wages. You know, he did a lot of odd jobs, and he saved his money. Okay, remember that. During this time, both people got married. Dr. Emerson got married to a lady who was actually from St. Louis, and Dred Scott got married. Now, eventually, Dr. Emerson sent for Dred Scott and his new wife to come down to Louisiana and be with him. Okay, Dred Scott traveled with his wife down to Louisiana, and I think about a year or so after he got there, Dr. Emerson actually died. Now, once Dr. Emerson died, he left his estate went to his wife, whose maiden name was Sanford. That's why when you look up the Dred Scott case, you will see Dred Scott versus Sanford, because the wife's name was Sanford, and eventually she passed on the estate to her brother, whose last name also was Sanford. Okay, now, once Dr. Emerson died, the wife then she basically leased or rented out Dred Scott to an army captain. So even back then, slaves could actually be leased or rented out to other people. Okay, so he was rented out, and during this time, I guess he had about $300 saved up, and he offered that $300 to Mrs. Sanford to purchase his freedom. She refused. Okay, after the estate was passed on to John Sanford, who was her brother, he offered the same amount of money for his freedom, and again, he was refused. This is when he decided to take his claim or his case to court. And his justification was that because he had lived in free states for those 2 years while traveling with Dr. Emerson, he was entitled to emancipation. And the definition of emancipation is to be free from slavery or free from bondage. So next, we'll talk about the proceedings of the case. Now, the proceedings began in 1847. Okay, 1847, he sues for his freedom in the Missouri Circuit Court, because he's in St. Louis again, because that's where Mrs. Sanford has moved back to. Okay, he files against Mrs. Sanford for his freedom, Missouri Circuit Court. He loses on a technicality. Now I want you to listen to this. He loses on a technicality. That technicality is that he cannot prove that he and his wife are the property of Mrs. Sanford. Now, here he is filing a suit to become a free man and get away from the bondage of Mrs. Sanford, but he loses because he can't even prove that he belongs to Mrs. Sanford. Does that make sense to you? Not much, right? So anyway, he refiles in 1850. Okay, there's a retrial in 1850 where the Missouri Circuit Court actually gives him his freedom. 2 years later, I think it's the United States, not the United States Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court for Missouri, United States District Court, something like that. The next higher level court reverses the decision and tells Dred Scott, you are a slave. You are not a free man. Okay. The Missouri Circuit Court concurs and rules the same. We're going to go with the reverse decision. You're not a free man. Okay. Dred Scott takes it to the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court. Okay. There's 9 justices there at the time. And in 1857, they ruled you are a slave. You cannot be a free man. You are a slave. That is the proceedings. Now, next, we're going to go into the logical reasoning behind the proceedings and why the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, told Dred Scott, you cannot be a free man. You are to remain a slave. Stand by. Now, let's get into the logical reasoning. Now, first of all, it's important to know there were 9 justices. 7 of them ruled that, or actually let's say it like this, Justice Taney, T-A-N-E-Y, wrote the majority opinion, and 6 others concurred with him. That means they agreed with him. So 7 of them agreed and decided that Dred Scott should remain a slave. 2 of them decided, or dissented, or basically they disagreed and think he should have his freedom, or they disagreed with the opinion. Okay, now this is important to know. The 7 justices that ruled that Dred Scott should be a slave, all 7 of them were appointed by presidents who were pro-slavery. Okay, out of those 7 that were appointed by presidents who were pro-slavery, 5 of them either had families that either currently owned slaves at that time or had previously owned slaves. So basically, the 7 justices were basically very pro-slavery. Okay, so here's the majority opinion. Dred Scott had to remain a slave because an African, let's say a Negro at that time, could not become a citizen of the United States, and the rights and protections of the Constitution did not pertain to him. Therefore, he could not sue. Okay, he could not sue. Okay, he had no right to sue in the first place. Okay. Another thing that was said by Justice Taney, T-A-N-E-Y, the Missouri Compromise that made this area of Illinois and Wisconsin, that made that a free state, was invalid. Congress did not have the authority to make a state a free state. Here's why, or here's what they claim is the reason. If you make a state, if Congress makes a state a free state, then you are violating a slave owner's 5th Amendment rights to due process under the law. Does that make sense to you? If you make a state a free state, you are violating the 5th Amendment constitutional right of due process of a slave owner. Now, I I need you to explain to me how that even makes sense. Okay, these are just some of the reasons why, even right now today, the Dred Scott decision is known as the worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court. It is a terrible decision. Okay, now another thing that they added, or at least Justice Taney added, T-A-N-E-Y, is that the Constitution, you could never be protected by, as an African, you could never be protected by the rights and protections under the Constitution because you did not look like the founding fathers of the Constitution. That's basically what they're saying. The founding fathers of the Constitution, who were all white, when they put that phrase in there, all men are created equal, it only pertained to people who look like the founding fathers. Therefore, people of African descent, whether free or slave or owned or property, whether they came from Africa and were brought into the country, or whether they were born here, as well as Native Americans, would never be protected by the rights of the Constitution, because neither one of those groups looked like the founding fathers. When they said all men are created equal, they were only talking about people that look like them. All right. Therefore, slaves, or especially slaves were not even men. Slaves were property. They were not men. They were property. Therefore, the Constitution could never pertain to them. Now, the two justices that disagreed, their argument is, or was, that number one, this is not even the whole Missouri Compromise thing. You're stepping out of bounds. That's not even your jurisdiction. This whole situation is not in your jurisdiction, and you did not have to invalidate the Missouri Compromise of 1820 in order to decide on this case, which basically tells you these 7 pro-slavery justices who agreed with that the Missouri Compromise was invalid, probably had an agenda to make that area a slave state, since they were pro-slavery, because that state was free. So they kind of had an agenda. They kind of used this case to push an agenda. You see what I'm saying? At the same time, one of the dissenting justices, the one who disagreed, challenged Taney by saying, how can you say that Africans don't fall under the Constitution when right at that time there are 5 states in the United States where Africans or Negroes are not only citizens, but they have the right to vote. So how is it that over here in these 5 states, they fall under the Constitution and they even have the right to vote? But yet over here in this territory, Dred Scott doesn't have the same privileges. That doesn't make sense. You see what I'm saying? It was just a terrible decision, okay? So I don't even think I need to talk about that anymore, okay? So now, let's talk about what happened after the decision, the whole aftermath, all right? I'll be right back. So, the aftermath of the decision, the Dred Scott decision, okay? 2 important things. Number 1, 3 months after the United States Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott was to remain a slave, 3 months, the Dred Scott's original owners, remember the Blow family, Peter Blow, Dred Scott grew up as a child with his sons. His sons actually were the ones who were helping him pay his legal fees. And 3 months after the decision, they purchased him from the Sanford family and then freed him, made him a free man. Anyway, like that was a whole waste of time. You see what I'm saying? But anyway, so he became a free man anyway. Okay? Another thing, the Dred Scott decision was such a terrible decision that a certain individual who decided to run for president constantly used the Dred Scott decision in his speeches that many people say helped him win the presidency. Okay, I'm gonna come back to that. Another thing that happened, it was such a terrible decision that it actually caused it more of a rift between the North and the South. This is the beginning of secession and possibly the beginning of the Civil War. Okay, so a lot of people are saying the Civil War wasn't because of slavery. It wasn't free slavery. Was it? Because the Dred Scott decision kicked this off. It created a huge separation between the North and the South. And that individual who ran for president kind of exemplified that by constantly preaching about the Dred Scott decision and being, because supposedly this individual was anti-slavery, but he kept preaching about the Dred Scott decision, and it helped him get elected president. And soon after this person was elected president, the Civil War kicked off. And of course, by now you know this individual was Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so the Dred Scott decision is a huge decision, not only in Black history, in American history. But how many of you have actually heard of this, have actually heard of the Dred Scott decision or Dred Scott while you were in school? Did you read about him in the history books? Did you read about the decision in the history books? You see what I'm saying? Yeah. This is why I make the videos. Okay. You gotta have knowledge of, if you're Black, you gotta have knowledge of self. Okay. Even if you're non-Black, it's good to know about us. Okay. It's good to know the truth. It's good to know history that you're obviously not gonna be taught in the school system. Okay. The Dred Scott decision was a huge decision, not only in the legal profession, but just in American history. And now you have the knowledge that you probably would not have gotten anywhere else. Okay, so I appreciate you watching the video. You know there's going to be more videos to come on Black history, information in history you need to know about your people that you're probably not going to get anywhere else. All right, I appreciate you watching.